exciting it is to be having our inaugural Not in My Workplace webinar, where we're talking about this incredibly important topic, respect at work. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that join us here this afternoon. I know that we've got people joining us from across Australia, and I'd love for you to get working on the chat box already and tell me where you're coming from across Australia or from overseas, if perhaps this is in fact an international webinar. I know one of the things that I've really enjoyed this year was reading The Yield, Tara June Winch's book that just won the Miles Franklin Award, and it was a really powerful novel for me, reflecting on the strength and history of Aboriginal culture, so I really recommend that to you. My name is Rosie Ween. It's my absolute pleasure to be your host this evening for this webinar. I'm a member of the Not in My Workplace committee. I'm also the Chief Executive of WaterAid. I still remember the moment when I needed to pitch to become a committee member. And as I stood around the table and looking at all these incredible women, I thought, what can I draw on to express why I want to be part of this group? And I drew on a quote that really resonates for me. It's by Margaret Mead, and she said, "Never doubt that a small group of active citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's all that ever has." And that's what really brings me tonight to this, and I hope it brings all of you thinking about what we can do to come together to change workplaces around Australia and further afield. And as we do come together, I hope that you're taking a moment to end the rest of your day and join us. We invited you to bring a beverage along to join us, so I wonder what it is that you've brought with you, your beverage. I can't remember if I mentioned it or not, I'm the Chief Executive of WaterAid, an international not-for-profit focused on clean water. So my beverage this evening is the good old local tap water, but I can see that I'm getting lots of messages where people are joining from. Kate, breaking news, we've got somebody joining us from South Africa. So this really has gone global. We've got people joining us from all around the world, all across Australia, and I hope that you've got a beverage settling down to join us. And I really do want to thank each and every one of you that's joining us tonight. Time is our most precious, unrenewable resource, and I really appreciate that you're putting your time into this important conversation tonight. I also would like to thank you. I hope that when you registered, you also took a moment to donate to Safe Steps Family Violence Resource Centre. As all of us needed to lock down under the first lockdown, I think it gives all of us a moment to pause and recognise that sadly for many women and children, their home is their least safe place to be. So it's really important during these times that we support organisations like Safe Steps Family Violence Resource Centre that's on the front line. I'd also like to thank Saxton and Scene Change for their incredible work into the lead up and delivery of our webinar tonight. So as we do go into the webinar, I'd ask and invite all of you to think about the importance of respect and safety while we are together online. We will be talking about topics that around sexual harassment, and I would remind you of that really important resource of 1800-RESPECT phone number to call in Australia if there are issues that you need support with. So by way of brief background about Not in My Workplace, it's a group of women that came together around this issue of sexual harassment in the workplace and really thinking that we can do better than this. How can we come together as leaders to bring about change? And initially we thought to celebrate and reflect on the important work that Kate Jenkins and her team have done. We thought we'd come together for an intimate evening and reflect on those findings. But Of course, with COVID, gathering together in person isn't possible, but we've been able to reimagine this to be a virtual event. So it is now my great pleasure for me to introduce to you the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins. We're going to now hear from Kate on her very important, indeed, Kate, I heard in media coverage it referred to as world first work that you've done, not just the incredible work that you and your team do in the national surveys looking at sexual harassment, but actually pausing with this review and bringing together your findings of how we really can look at eliminating sexual harassment from all workplaces across Australia. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Kate, to hear an overview of your report, and then we'll move into question time. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here today. I feel like I'm a bit of a frequent flyer. I really love the group Not in My Workplace, and I've been at your Melbourne, your Sydney and your Ballarat sessions, so I feel very privileged that you do ask me to come back. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, excuse me, of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, from whose traditional lands I'm presenting today, and acknowledge all of the lands on which participants are attending from. As Rosie kindly mentioned, I'm the Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner, starting the role in 2016, and I've worked on a number of significant Australian Human Rights Commission projects since that time, including with universities, with Defence, and with Play by the Rules. And as mentioned, I've spent the last 18 months finalising Australia's first national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces, which is our focus of our discussion today, and as Rosie's mentioned, a world first. So if I can go to the slides, I'll start as a quick refresher with the definition of sexual harassment. So this is the definition, but if you hit again, Anne, at its simplest, the definition of sexual harassment is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, which reasonably causes the person harassed to be offended, humiliated, or intimidated. So put simply, it's unwelcome, offensive sexual conduct at work. And our focus was absolutely at work. Next slide, please. So the National Inquiry commenced in 2018 with the support of government, unions and employers, and off the back of the global Me Too movement, which placed a renewed spotlight on the prevalence of sexual harassment at work, and I know was the driver behind the Not in My Workplace group. The goal of the inquiry was to examine the nature, prevalence and drivers of sexual harassment in Australian workplaces and measures to address and prevent it. Our Respect at Work report is the culmination of 18 months of work involving a survey of 10,000 workers with 60 public consultations with 600 participants. I suspect some of you are here today, 460 written submissions, global research and economic modelling. I launched Respect at Work alongside the Minister for Women, Senator the Honourable Marise Payne, on Friday the 6th of March 2020. Minister Payne and the Attorney General, the Honourable Christian Porter, welcomed the report and said the Australian Government would carefully consider its recommendations. They also underlined the government's commitment to ensuring Australian workplaces are safe and free from sexual harassment. Next slide, please. Many participants in the inquiry shared with me their devastating experiences of sexual harassment at work and the inadequate responses they faced. Most heartbreaking to me was the long-term harm and financial hardship caused by the experience. We found that sexual harassment is a common experience. Our survey and inquiry told us that workplace sexual harassment is pervasive. It occurs in every industry, in every location, and at every level in Australian workplaces. In 2018, 1 in 3 Australian workers had experienced workplace sexual harassment in the last 5 years, which was up from 1 in 5 in 2012. We found the current system places the onus on the victim to complain, and yet we know that only 17% of people who said they were sexually harassed at work made a complaint. We found that sexual harassment happens in all workplaces. Our 2018 survey collected industry-specific data for the first time across 21 ABS-defined industry sectors, which provided a valuable resource for industry action. And finally, we found that sexual harassment has a high cost. Deloitte Access Economics modelled the economic cost of workplace sexual harassment for the inquiry. They estimated that workplace sexual harassment cost the Australian economy $3.8 billion in 2018. Next slide, please. Overall, it became clear that the current system for addressing workplace sexual harassment in Australia is complex and confusing for victims and employers. Our inquiry revealed an urgent need to shift from the current reactive complaints-based approach to one that requires positive action from employers and had a focus on prevention. Our Respect at Work report proposes a new approach which builds upon Australia's existing policies and initiatives through 55 recommendations which fall under 5 key areas of focus. Firstly, data and research to deliver useful industry-based information about the nature of sexual harassment and effective responses. Secondly, primary prevention of sexual harassment through education, media, and community-wide initiatives. Thirdly, a refocused legal and regulatory framework, which recognises the mutually reinforcing roles of discrimination, workplace, and safety laws. Fourth, better workplace prevention and responses, which are leader-driven, practical, and adaptable. And finally, better support, advice, and advocacy for people who experience sexual harassment. And so for today, I plan to focus on the workplace prevention and response, the legal and regulatory framework, and the support and advocacy recommendations in the Respect at Work report. And I also look forward to answering your questions. So in terms of the workplace prevention and response framework, during the inquiry, there was widespread acknowledgement by employers, workers, and their representative bodies that the current approach to preventing workplace sexual harassment was not working. We heard that some employer methods had remained largely unchanged for decades and were failing to prevent or effectively respond to workplace sexual harassment. It became clear through the inquiry that employers wanted greater guidance on what good practice looks like for addressing workplace sexual harassment. And in response, the Commission recommended a new framework for workplaces to better prevent and respond to sexual harassment. The new framework provides a more holistic approach that looks beyond policies, training, and complaint handling procedures. It's adaptable for businesses of all sizes and in all industries. The new framework has 7 areas of focus, 4 to prevent sexual harassment and 3 to respond to sexual harassment. So to better prevent sexual harassment, we need firstly strong leadership to create a safe workplace environment. And that's not simply just the CEOs, leadership right through an organisation. Secondly, a greater focus on risk assessment, drawing on a commitment to transparency, a willingness to learn from past experience, a philosophy of continuous improvement with the workplace, and particularly drawing from a lot of good practice in the work health and safety area. Thirdly, we talked about and looked at the organisational culture of trust and respect, that it was consistently raised with us that the best workplaces that were ones that had general cultures of integrity, trust, and respect. And lastly, we need to use policies, workplace education, training, all types of interactions to improve knowledge and develop a much better collective understanding of expected workplace behaviours and processes and responses. But what happens when sexual harassment does occur? We heard of lots of stories of responses, and what we've come up with is a framework that recommends 3 areas in which employers can focus and improve their response efforts. Firstly, providing support to workers through the reporting process and prioritising worker wellbeing as a number 1 priority. Secondly, we've recommended increasing reporting options for workers and addressing barriers to reporting. It's particularly important to create new ways for sexual harassment to be addressed other than launching a formal investigation, which is a route that very few victims wish to go down. And lastly, measuring, which means collecting data at a workplace level and an industry level so that we can understand the prevalence, nature, and impacts of workplace sexual harassment and evaluate the effectiveness of initiatives designed to address it. To embed this new framework within Australia, we made several recommendations focused on employers and the supports that would help them improve their practice. For instance, we recommended that the Australian Institute of Company Directors and the Governance Institute of Australia develop education and training for board members and company officers. And we also recommended that the ASX Corporate Governance Council introduce sexual harassment indicators against which ASX listed entities can report. We also made some industry specific recommendations, including that particular licensing and accreditation schemes could hold members accountable for sexual harassment, but particularly that industries should come together to develop industry specific responses like prevalence surveys, codes of practice, awareness raising campaigns. There's no reason why every organisation needs to make its own new program. Of course, employers and workers will need guidance as they work to implement these recommendations, and that's why we also recommended that employers, employer associations and unions work together to develop an online platform called Respect at Work, which would be a one-stop shop for information, education and resources on workplace sexual harassment. Next slide, please. The 3 main legislative schemes that regulate sexual harassment in the workplace are the anti-discrimination laws, the Fair Work system and the work health and safety laws. Our inquiry concluded that the interaction between these 3 schemes is confusing and sometimes inconsistent for workers and for employers. However, we found that there are significant benefits to each of these regimes, which are well recognised across Australia. So our recommendations are designed to strengthen and clarify these frameworks so that they can work in a complementary and mutually reinforcing manner. We found that the Sex Discrimination Act, or the SDA, should continue to be the primary piece of legislation regulating sexual harassment at work and the anchor for consistency across the state and territory Equal Opportunity Acts and the Fair Work and safety regimes. We identified a range of enhancements required to make the SDA and the Australian Human Rights Commission Act better suited to contemporary experiences of work. Those enhancements include clarifying that the SDA covers all people in the world of work, including those who are paid, unpaid and self-employed and state public servants. Expressly prohibiting sex-based harassment and prohibiting creating an intimidating, hostile, humiliating or offensive environment on the basis of sex. Extending liability to those who aid or permit another person to sexually harass a person, and empowering the Australian Human Rights Commission to inquire into systemic unlawful discrimination, including systemic sexual harassment. We've also recommended that a positive duty be introduced to the SDA. The positive duty requires all employers to take reasonable and proportionate measures to eliminate sex discrimination, sexual harassment and victimisation as far as possible, and would be accompanied by functions for the Commission to assess compliance with the duty and enforcement. We observed during the inquiry that many large employers assumed such a positive duty already exists, as it does in Victoria. The workplace prevention and response framework, which I mentioned earlier, will be key to enabling employers to comply with this duty. And I look forward to discussing this further with participants today in the question and answer section if you're interested. During the inquiry, we also examined the role that non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, have in perpetuating sexual harassment. And you might recall that's been quite topical, particularly starting with the Harvey Weinstein allegations. After close consideration, we determined that NDAs play a valuable role in protecting the privacy and confidentiality of parties and providing closure. However, I'm concerned that blanket NDAs that prohibit any discussion of complaints also undermine the prevention of sexual harassment by impeding proper scrutiny by boards and governance bodies, by preventing organisations learning from complaints and identifying systemic issues, and by making it easier for perpetrators to reoffend with impunity within the same workplace or beyond. Therefore, we've recommended the Commission develop a guideline identifying best practice principles for the use of NDAs in workplace sexual harassment matters to inform the development of a regulation on NDAs in the future. We heard that Fair Work is regarded as the central place for workplace grievances and a system that has a long and respected history in this country. While the Fair Work Act covers grounds of discrimination, currently it does not expressly prohibit sexual harassment. Employers told us that they got mixed signals from the Fair Work Commission when it came to sexual harassment misconduct, especially through the unfair dismissal jurisdiction. Workers with multiple workplace grievances told us they wanted a simpler system to raise workplace concerns in one place. So our key recommendations for changes to the Fair Work system include expressly prohibiting sexual harassment under the Fair Work Act, using the definition in the SDA, introducing a Stop Sexual Harassment order equivalent to the Stop Bullying order currently in the Act, clarifying that sexual harassment can be conduct amounting to a valid reason for dismissal in determining whether a dismissal was harsh, unjust, or unreasonable, and including sexual harassment in the definition of serious misconduct in the Fair Work regulations. Australian work health and safety laws already impose a duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment in the context of the broad duty to eliminate or manage hazards or risks to a worker's health, which includes psychological health and therefore sexual harassment. We heard through the inquiry that there's an urgent need to raise awareness that sexual harassment is a work health and safety issue already. We therefore recommended changes to the model work health and safety regulation to deal with psychological health and development of guidelines on sexual harassment, which could be used to inform the development of a code of practice on sexual harassment. Next slide, please. We also made a number of recommendations on the support, advice, and advocacy space through the inquiry. We were told that support services for victims, survivors remained underdeveloped, under-resourced, and difficult to navigate. Respect at Work recognised the valuable information, resources, and referral services provided to victims by unions and other groups such as community legal centres. We recommended further investment in these existing services, and we also recommended that a workplace sexual harassment council be established and funded to improve coordination, consistency, and clarity across prevention and response activities. Council membership would be delegates from the Fair Work Commission, Safe Work Australia, workers' compensation authorities, human rights authorities, employer associations, and unions. One of the Council's key tasks will be to coordinate the development of guidelines to support standardisation across information and referral services for victims. We also heard repeatedly of the importance of timely access to specialist counselling for victims of sexual harassment. Given the prominence and existing expertise of the 1800 Respect hotline, the Commission recommended that it be funded and expanded to support sexual harassment victims. We also did discuss and consider organisations such as Safe Steps, providing critical gendered-informed, trauma-informed services to victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault. The Commission found that support and advice and advocacy should be delivered in a holistic way, providing as seamless an experience as possible for victims and other people affected by workplace sexual harassment. And this could involve smooth and speedy referrals between services or access to an all-inclusive support, advice and advocacy service, such as the Working Women's Legal Centres provide in some states. Our last recommendation was the adequate resourcing of Legal Aid Commission and community legal centres to provide quality legal advice and advocacy to victims of sexual harassment. Last slide. Our world has changed dramatically since our report was tabled in Parliament on the 5th of March. The need to address sexual harassment has not lessened. However, COVID-19 did change the immediate priority for our governments and many workplaces, and rightly so. However, as the recent headlines surrounding members of the legal profession have demonstrated, sexual harassment is a problem that continues to need urgent attention. So while the government's official response to Respect at Work has been delayed, I think you'll agree that the workplace leaders, such as yourselves, already have in our comprehensive report the information you need to take action to create more productive, respectful and safe workplaces. In one way, Respect at Work reflects that sexual harassment is a complex issue, and our recommendations are accordingly numerous and wide-ranging. But the core of what we're talking about could not be simpler. Workplace sexual harassment is not inevitable, it's not acceptable, and it is preventable. And I appreciate you all taking time to participate today and encourage you to consider how you can help to make your workplaces safe by eliminating sexual harassment. Thank you. And Rosie, I'll hand back to you because I'm looking forward to discussing any questions and hearing more about what people are drinking and where they're coming from.
Thank you very much, Kate. It feels a bit underwhelming for it just to be throwing back to me and not for you to be hearing a resounding room full of applause. The work that you and your team have done and the contributions of those that partnered with you in the research, those that shared their stories that you referred to as individual heartbreaking stories, the power of those come through in the findings of the report and particularly the vision that you create. So for the replacement of the massive room of applause, it is me giving you a golf clap. Congratulations. It is now in the power of the questions and the conversation that we have that we can move to Kate. So to all of you participating online, please do pop in the chat box your questions for me to share with Kate. Kate, to give you a flavour of the beverages and the parts of the world, we've got people joining us from all around Australia and, as I mentioned, South Africa. We've got people in Perth having an early morning coffee or a coffee, mid-morning coffee. We've got people joining us from Sydney, across Victoria, and there's a mix of beverages of dandelion tea and a couple of people not wanting to be judged. And just to be very clear, this is a non-judgmental space on what you're drinking. So it's wonderful having you all here. And now I would really invite your questions to Kate and to pop those into the chat box for me. That would be just fantastic. Perhaps, Kate, as you were reflecting on that and talking about some of the opportunities for collaboration across perhaps unusual partners, although not so now in terms of unions and others, and sharing information, what were some of those, I guess, easy steps that you could see that we could just pick from existing things that are working to really speed up progress in this area?
Probably one of the main things that I became really adamant about was the value of industry, bringing together industry groups to all work uniformly on the issue of sexual harassment. And one of the main reasons for that is because it was really clear that employers and organisations feel quite, if you go to the bigger organisations, they're very petrified that they'll be exposed that sexual harassment exists in their workplace, that it'll affect their reputations, their sort of attraction as an employer of choice. And it will mar them with a terrible reputation that will affect share prices. But the reality is, when you look at the statistics, 1 in 3 Australian workers have experienced sexual harassment. So actually sexual harassment, I didn't find the workplace with absolutely no sexual harassment, or at least I didn't find the industry. So the reality is it's quite a common experience. And if you can bring industries together, that is where you can see really the systemic factors that are at play. So I do think industries are quite different to each other, but that underpinning gender inequality and power disparity is at play. But if you, for example, this, to some degree, this started in the media and entertainment sector. So when really early, actually because government prompted them, I convened a round table of players in the media sector. And when we sat down, you realise that people tend to move around in the sort of acting and media and entertainment sector. They're often on short-term contracts. They're in a workplace where, sort of acting in sexualised way can sometimes be part of the job. That at the top, there's still mostly men. It's highly competitive, and most of the work is word of mouth, whether you're a camera operator or a makeup artist or an actor. And so all of those things put together create a high risk of sexual conduct occurring that's unwelcome, but also a really low chance that people will complain. When they came together, and that is employer associations, unions, some of the big companies, to start talking about this, they all had the same problem and they all had an equal interest in eliminating it. And one of the first things they decided to do was bring together a code of conduct that would apply to their industry. And anyone who's heard me talk, I didn't say this to them, but I just thought it's not for lack of a policy that this is occurring. So there's this idea that, sexual harassment occurs, I'm going to write a better policy and now hopefully that will fix it. And, I heard across the country so many scenarios. It has almost no connection. If your company has a good policy, it doesn't mean that on the ground it's not happening. So I was a bit sort of ho-hum, but I was supportive because there was absolutely joint action. But in fact, what happened by coming up with a joint policy and then starting to develop joint resources on the education and building a campaign around the industry is, firstly, it stopped duplicating resources. Secondly, it didn't matter where you were working, you were clear on what the position was, how you made complaints. You didn't have to work out who's the new person that I need to talk to. Thirdly, all your education made sense to you and it sort of spoke to your industry experience. And so while they're not perfect, it actually really, and then they started pulling apart what were the particular risks. I've seen that with universities. We're watching a quick action in the legal profession after many years of action, but not much progress. I've seen it in, I know mining is considering the same sort of initiative. So I guess that would be, from a workplace point of view, wherever you're sitting, if you're not the boss, I would ask your leaders, are you part of an industry initiative? I saw it in hospitality, so it could be big industries or small industries, but have you come together to consider and come together with not your usual. So one of the things that happens is employers might all talk to each other, but unions have an incredible amount to add. Places like Safe Steps or, civil society organisations that have specialty expertise in gender or violence against women have lots to add. So there's lots of different players that if you bring them together, it's the cocktail that really makes a difference.
Lovely segue back to our beverages there. I think, Kate, I love that example of showing how we can get people together and really drive action as well as shift the culture in the process that you were describing. Now, you touched on things in terms of legal structures, and we've got two questions that I might put to you The first one is from Sarah asking about your proposed framework. And Sarah's really keen to understand what's different under the proposed framework in terms of enforceable obligations of employers. And the second question that comes from Vanessa is, how do we work together to make these recommendations law? So to understand what the differences are, but then also what's the next steps in terms of putting this into action and making the recommendations law?
So some of the difference from in terms of that first part of the question, what do we do? How's it different in practice? To some degree, no, I'll go to the second one first. I would encourage anyone to just use your channels to say that the amendments recommended in the report should be call on government to implement them. The reality is I've obviously done that already. I know the Law Council has come out with that position. I think when you look at them, they just make sense. They're just to fill the gaps and make it all to work better together. So anything you can do to just use your voice to tell government, because actually employers and unions are both mostly supportive, and particularly through the inquiry, we had a reference group that was a mix of all of those perspectives. So I appreciate any help, but I do know government is absolutely considering those changes right now, even though legal changes can take time. There is no doubt that there's momentum, and I'm really grateful for that. So support's good. That's my first comment on what you can do. But what does it mean right now? I think there's a couple of things. One is we have recommended the positive duty. That already exists in Victoria. Also, the equivalent kind of proactive duty exists across the country under work health and safety laws. So to some degree, what we were trying to do in really clarifying that is to really say to employers, stop waiting for complaints to come up. This is your responsibility. It's not just your liability if someone complains. So I'm not sure that the current system doesn't already set that up, but over time, the way it's been interpreted by lawyers and by employers is really, we really worry about sexual harassment when a complaint comes up. And in the absence of complaints, we actually assume there is no problem in our workplace. So our report has really set the bar very, the line very clear that sexual harassment is really common. We've had campaigns, we've got Not in My Workplace, we've got surveys, we've got industry surveys. That is not up for debate anymore. And the expectation is of employers to take action without requiring individuals to complain. So that's, in terms of what's different, I would say there's legal reasons why that already exists, but in practice that hasn't been how employers have approached sexual harassment. So I would say that is the critical legal kind of framework that I'm reinforcing. But my second part, if I go to lawyers, because I'm a lawyer and lawyers clearly have had a big say in what employers do, is that lawyers have really preferenced the laws on unfair dismissal, really procedural fairness, over the welfare of victims, and also over the opportunity to find different reporting avenues. So when we talk to employers, they sort of say, well, if someone comes forward, this is what we have to do. We have to investigate. We have to, give everyone the chance to answer. We've got to come up with sort of a kind of a, quasi-judicial process. I actually think that's misinterpreting the law, or at least it's taking a particular legalistic kind of formal investigation approach to an issue that you could equally say, well, number one priority is safety for my workers. If someone comes forward but says, I'm not actually, I will be most unwell if we have to go through a 6-month investigation process, then we kind of need to be sophisticated enough to work around that. So one of the things, and I would have been one of the employers that said, when complaints come forward, you need to get details. But now I'm of a different view that if someone wants to bring an anonymous complaint forward, that is a perfectly legitimate avenue. The reality is right now, bringing a complaint forward does in reality create real risks for the person coming forward. There is a real reason why people don't come forward. It's not that they don't want anything to be done. It's that they don't want to pay the personal career or personal price. So looking at different avenues and also being a bit more flexible. Of course, if you're looking to terminate someone's employment or take some serious action, you have to follow a due process and there's natural justice. So I'm not suggesting for a minute that won't happen, but sexual harassment is a wide variety of behaviours. The most common is sexual jokes, sexual comments, things that you mightn't sack someone for on a first offence. But that because we've only got sort of a system of you've got zero or atomic, our recommendations are really saying the change will be in terms of reporting, put support up front and also create some more options for reporting so you can find more practical ways at a lower level to stop sexual harassment.
Thanks, Kate. And there are a couple of questions coming in on reporting. I'll get to those in a moment. One thing, before I ask you your next question, I want to ask all of our participants online to do something for me. Now, this is assuming that many of you are sitting at your device with another device at hand. I want to ask you a question now to answer for Kate and I and for all of us. I want to ask you how you're feeling about sexual harassment in the workplace. And I want you to tell me through a poll that I've set up. So if you go to www.menti.com, that's MENTI, www.menti.com. And then when you get there, it's going to ask you for a code. And that code, the information will pop in the chat box in a moment. The team is so amazing. It's here already. The code is 359267. So we'd love to hear from everybody. How are you feeling about sexual harassment in the workplace? So the details are in the chat box. Get on your other device and feed your thoughts in. Now, Kate, there's a really important question in here. Asking you, this is from Nicole, and for those of you asking questions, I'm only referring to your first name unless in the chat you've told me where you work. I'm not sure what people were up for being shared, but this is a really great question from Nicole. And she's asking, Kate, did you look at intersectional impact of sexual harassment for people of colour or First Nations people or people with disability? For marginalised groups, harassment is multi-layered.
We absolutely did, and our recommendation is very strongly arguing for a better intersectional response, including from employers. So I'll just do my show and tell. So so you can find the answer to almost everything. Mine's a bit tagged, but the report is significant. And in the chapter looking at the type, understanding sexual harassment, what we identified was there are certain people that are at greater risk of sexual harassment. There's certain industries that have higher prevalence, and there's certain environments where there's a greater risk. So to go to those different categories, oh, by the way, if you're a bit less enthusiastic about the big version, that the community guide is fabulous as well. So what we found in particular was that LGBTI workers were at a greater risk. So where the average is 1 in 3, it was closer to 1 in 2 as workers. Similarly for people with disabilities, and we found a high risk for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as migrant workers, particularly those on short-term visas. So it's really clear that the different groups do experience those intersecting forms of disadvantage. And we held for those groups some focus groups specifically targeted at them. And we got some submissions as well with those specific concerns. And I remember we did two, one in Sydney, one in Melbourne, LGBTI targeted consults, and they really stuck with me because as we went around the room, those participants said, look, we get sexually harassed like everyone else, and then we get our own version of sexual harassment that's about really quite specific questions about our sexual activities, our bodies, you know, what we do, that they can convert us, you know, a whole lot of, like, really, it made a whole lot of sense that they were getting, experiencing much greater forms of sexual harassment. And so my sense, I've done a webinar with ACON, Pride in Diversity. So really looking at, for employers, for example, I would like for them to have a much better understanding that actually it's not the same for everyone. It's there is definitely high risk for young people. There's high risk for women, although the rates for men are still quite high, and for LGBTI community. So you need to be understanding that it's not, well, it wouldn't happen here because it doesn't happen to me kind of experience, that some of those people will be even more fearful of coming forward.
And that is something that's coming through in some of the comments that people are talking about in terms of also more vulnerable, insecure work that people are in and the risk that they face in terms of reporting. And a linked question as well to that comes from Amy, asking if you looked at how high internal turnover or transfer impacts the willingness to report and or use of transfer as a way to perhaps transfer the problem.
We did, and one of the things as I went around is there was a lot of conversation, a lot of questions or curiosity about how is this happening? You know, it used to be terrible. Surely the new generation won't put up with this. And so as we went through, I did start to be able to say to people, okay, well, you're assuming things just get better over time. But most of those people are people who'd been around. They were sort of my age people who were not young, who were often the blokes, who were often the CEOs. And they're sort of saying, how could this be? And so I started talking to them about, well, your organisation, we're still a long way off gender equality, particularly in our senior ranks. So that's a factor. We've had a real drop in union membership. That seems to be a factor in terms of education and people being aware of their rights. But probably the most significant change over time, I think, is the change in the way we do work and the way that work is done in industries and across the board. So you're talking about those short term. I think when I started, I remember someone would start a job at Australia Post when they were 20 and they would work there until they retired at 65. It simply doesn't happen even for people who are in what I think Natalie James would call regularised employment. But the reality is we've got a lot more flexible employment, a lot more short-term contracts, a lot less secure employment, a lot more casual work, particularly higher rates for women in part-time, and a lot more short-term contracts. So even in the course of the National Inquiry, we were funded to do the inquiry, and the majority of my team for that period were absolutely only on a contract for the period of the inquiry. So most of them had a 12-month contract. So it is, and then we've got gig economy, then in any industry, there's now labour hire. So it's so much more intersecting, and it's also so much more relying on different referral to get your next job. And your next job might be just in 6 months. So there is no question that that is a big contributor. And I'm concerned that one of the impacts of COVID is that is going to become even more of an inhibitor. And so the real pressure has to be on employers to be much more aware of that broader obligation, much more proactive, because if you thought people didn't want to complain before now, I think there's just, you know, the fear of losing that next opportunity is going to be even greater.
Yeah, that's right. People are in such fragile situations. I am going to group together a few questions. We're getting amazing range of questions coming through, Kate. You've really stimulated a lot of questions and thinking and reflection from our community online. There's a question, and rightly or wrongly, I'm going to lump perpetrators and questions about the role of men in one go, and please correct me if the statistics don't reflect that that's the right linkage. A question on what your thinking is in terms of the role of rehabilitation for perpetrators. Anna, thinking about this as saying, well, if it's 1 in 3 people that experience this, clearly there's a lot of work and important work to do with perpetrators. A reflection that we already have the male champions of change as an existing industry body. Do you see a role for them to play? And perhaps a slightly counter view or a cautioning in terms of the male champions of change with a recent incident involving a male champion of change not actually speaking out strongly against that incident. Sorry, I'm not across what that person is referring to. So a couple of questions linked in. I can repeat any of those if that wasn't clear, Kate.
No, I can talk to that, and I can talk about men as well more broadly, because I went into this, I have a, I have a view that I did go into it with the view that education and initiatives should, deal with all the workforce, and my traditional practice as a lawyer, so I was 20 years as an employment lawyer, really divided training by there's management and leadership, and then there's staff, and you kind of design the training around that. So if I talk firstly about perpetrators, but also training and education and how we change the cultural norm. I remember years ago doing, there was some research that really how people pathologize sexual harassment. That view that, oh, well, it's inevitable, it's how humans interact. But I remember years ago reading something that said, actually, the majority of sexual harassment wouldn't happen if people thought it was unacceptable in their workplace. But they look around and everyone's behaving this way, so you continue. So there might still be a portion, but the majority of people wouldn't do it. So if I start with the leadership and the culture, a lot of that is about saying, you know what, the leaders set the tone. The boards have a role that you need to, when I spoke to young people and said, I had some horrendous experience. I had one consultation with a group of about 8 around 22-year-olds. The majority of them had gone to university, and so only 2 of them had just got their first full-time jobs. All the others had 7 years of casual work and just really terrible, terrible stories, and very low awareness that it was all unlawful. But when I said to them, okay, you've had some good employers, what's the difference? And they just, it was pretty common. They said, we just know people just behave more respectfully, but you also know you can talk to their boss just said, if, this happens to you, come and talk to me, we'll sort it out. They didn't say, come and talk to me, I'll take a witness statement, we'll, get 4 other witness statements, all this sort of stuff that people are scared of. And as a young person, that's all they wanted. They wanted to know that generally people behave decently, and if I've got a problem, I can speak to my boss and it's not going to become a drama, but they'll help me. So when I go to education, I think leadership, culture, and then the kind of education was really about this should be everyday conversation. So there's no question we heard that this training in a good organisation is done once every 2 years through an online program that has so little impact on actually what happens. But the safety model is we'll have a toolbox talk every Monday. We'll just talk about what are the general things we should be doing differently to make sure it's more safe. So there was a sense of that needs to change and that will reduce. In terms of the question about perpetrators, my sense was, and I think in practice, is employers have had a view that this is individual misconduct. You've got to prove whether it happened, and then you wag your finger at them and you tell them, if you do this again, we'll sack you. And that really, that is just has made no difference to people's behaviours. There were some sessions I had where people were really confused why someone had lost their job when they felt like, well, everyone else does what just happened with Joe told this joke, but I tell jokes like that. Like, it was completely opaque to people. So there are a couple of things that I came up with a view of, which is I think there is a role for training that really talks to men in a different way. There is research that suggests the training that's done as a sort of a bystander kind of training model, not suggesting that bystanders are responsible to prevent sexual harassment, but if you train in a way that's not like looking in the eyes of a man saying, you mustn't do this, men are not responding well to what is known as prohibitive training, which is because they walk in thinking, well, you think I'm a perpetrator, how dare you? And they can leave more annoyed and more likely. So I like that conversation of thinking about what would something more sophisticated than just wait till someone does it wrong and then tell them off, give them a warning, whatever it might be. There seemed to be really nothing in the middle of what's a broader cultural change. But I do think that broader cultural change is about the whole workplace rather than I'll get you. I mean, I've done that as a lawyer. I used to have to sit down with blokes and really talk about whether they shouldn't drink as much as they were drinking at the Christmas party if that's when they misbehaved. But actually, when you look at it systemically, it's not just one bad bloke, it's a kind of a whole cultural thing. So I am really keen that we engage men more. That I found that men, some of the male groups were not as sophisticated in their understanding of what sexual harassment actually was. And that made sense to me when you realise that women, you know, I often joke that women kind of know with fine detail the difference between a hug from a male colleague that you're friends with and a hug that's a bit creepy and a bit too long and, you know, from your boss that you never really wanted to have anything to do with. Men were confused by that nuance, and I think we just need to kind of try and lean into that. The question about male champions of change. So I've been involved with male champions of change that my predecessor set up. And particularly I'm involved with a particular group. I've had conversations. I do think that male and female CEOs have an important role to play. I think that we can expect them to step up on this. I know the group I've worked with, and I know more broadly that they are looking at some really quite specific work on sexual harassment and setting new standards. And I think that's really to be welcomed. And I look forward to that coming out. And I also think that we need to engage when I'm not in the camp. I don't really understand why, if we want to move gender equality forward, that we spend a lot of time complaining about men who have said they want to move gender equality forward. But I know that's a nuanced discussion for today. But I know that the issue of men in leadership roles and sexual harassment, we need them to step up and we need them to help us move it forward. And I think Male Champions is one place where we've got a really, a group that are listening and keen to learn. So I think that's important. And I also think everyone who's on this call is important. So the momentum is critical, and they do care to be doing things, so let's go with that.
Kate, you wouldn't believe, well, I'm afraid we've still got more questions, but we're not going to get through all of them. But thank you for finishing, I think, on that vision of where we're heading. And hopefully you can see on the iPad here, if we're lucky, it might come up on the screen, all of the different feelings that everyone's had. Look at the magic team here, just doing an amazing job. And we can see there the feeling that is in the room with us, although we're not with you in your home. And I do want to thank you for sharing your reflections and this incredible Respect at Work report. And I wanted to share a quick quote from Audre Lorde from her essay, The Uses of Anger, to leave this as an action for all of you. Every woman has a well-stocked arsenal of anger, potentially useful against those oppressions, personal and institutional, which brought that anger into being. Focused with precision, it can become a powerful source of energy, serving progress and change. So I want to ask all of us to use our anger, frustration and sadness around this issue of sexual harassment and channel it to bring about change. So please do gather together around your board tables, your Facebook groups, your kitchen tables with other leaders and other people from your sector, and let's absolutely achieve this vision that we've created of eliminating sexual harassment from all workplaces and creating respect at work. Thank you again, Kate, and thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you.